Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to my channel. This is the Hungry Math Professor here, and today I'm going to be discussing the Federalist Papers written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. And I had the unique opportunity of reading this with several other people over the course of 13 weeks as part of this Meetup discussion group. So I'm a part of this meetup discussion group called Reading Philosophy and Psychology in New York City. So you can find it on Meetup. I'll probably post a link on the for this to this video to this site because if you're interested in discussions I'm doing, you very well may be interested in this group. And I host discussions, and I also just attend discussions of other hosts. And this was originally started by Ryan Hallman, who's since moved to Rochester, but still hosts things on Zoom. And so check it out. You might find those interesting, the ones on Zoom or the ones in person. And anyway, I had the fortunate opportunity of hosting this over 13 weeks. We read roughly 30 pages, close to 5 to 7 of the Federalist Papers per week, and we're able to discuss, right? So not only did we read them, and I usually reread them a few times and write notes and then discuss them. So we got a much sort of deeper understanding, but also it broke it up a little bit. So it didn't have to read it all in one chance. I will say, I'm glad I read all of the Federalist Papers, but I think there's a reason why probably in law schools and things, they don't usually assign all of them. So if you are interested in reading the Federalist Papers, my recommendation would probably be, I mean, if you really want to read them all, of course, go for it. Especially if you can discuss it with other people and kind of break it up into groups like I did. I think that's great. But if you want to read it and you don't want to commit 13 weeks to it or something, I would recommend, looking up a list of like the main ones maybe and reading those. You can find these on, if you Google it, like the list of the main Federalist Papers, you'll find a list, and then you can go deeper if you like. Though I am glad I read them all. Let me try to set the scene a little bit about what's going on here, right? So let's go back to our U.S. history classes, if you had one as a kid. Um, at this point in U.S. history, we had the Articles of Confederation, um, but the problem with the Articles of Confederation is they were so heavily in favor of states' rights that the federal government that was a part of that was so weak, right? And so even though there was a federal government, there was basically like a Congress of sort, so there was federal, and they had some powers under the Articles of Confederation. There was like no teeth to the Articles of Confederation, and so basically, there was no way for this federal Congress to really force the states to get in line with what they were enacting. And so basically, the states were over time just doing whatever they wanted and ignoring the rulings in different cases. So this was a huge problem. And I think at this point in U.S. history, it was clear that this was a problem. No one was debating whether the Articles of Confederation was a problem, um, but what they are debating is how to fix the problem, right? And so some people, I think it seems to be that they just want to like, just adjust the Articles of Confederation. Yeah, that's it's not working, but it's not completely wrong. We just need to like make some adjustments to it, right? But Hamilton, Madison, and Jay in the Federalist Papers are not on that front, right? So what happened is that there was a federal convention where a bunch of people got together and wrote what we think of as the U.S. Constitution, but it wasn't ratified yet. So it needed to be ratified by the states. They needed at least 9 of the 13 states to ratify it for it to be official under the code that was written into the convention. And there was a problem because, in particular, New York was a holdout and didn't look like was going to vote for the Constitution. So, in particular, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay are writing these papers literally in the newspaper of various different newspapers in New York. So they're literally writing in New York newspapers, trying to convince the people there at the time who could, are involved in ratifying the Constitution that this is the right way to go. And so you got to keep that in mind when you read these papers, right? They're newspaper articles. They are not textbooks. They're not like poli sci. philosophy books or anything like that. They are very practical articles, and they have a very clear bias in mind. They want the U.S. Constitution to be ratified. That being said, there's lots of important details and lots of good perspectives and arguments in here. But you do have to remember that at times the arguments feel very sophist and maybe not always the strongest arguments for people on the other side are given, right? Again, they're very practical. They're trying to write these papers to get the U.S. Constitution ratified, and they want to convince you that that's the right thing to do. And you got to keep that in mind. So there are times when you're reading these Federalist Papers that you're like, man, I wouldn't mind hearing a stronger argument from the opposition. Maybe I'm missing something here, especially since I have no, I'm not ratifying the Constitution. I'm not a part of that moment in history. I'm just studying it to understand the different arguments and things. At times, I was like, yeah, it'd be nice to hear maybe a stronger counter argument than what Hamilton, Madison, or Jay are presenting. But I understand why they write that way. If I was in their position and I felt like the U.S. Constitution was the right way to go, you have to think about how momentous of a time this is, and also how unstable of a particular time this is. If this U.S. Constitution doesn't get ratified, what happens next? You're in a real crisis moment. The colonies maybe never become unified. So you have to take some time to reflect on the weight and the gravity of the moment. These are like these very rare moments in history where if we don't ratify the Constitution, who knows what happens to United States, or does that ever even become a thing, and how does that affect the rest of history, right? So we can't answer these counterfactuals, but I think we can at least appreciate the weight of the time period. And I'm sure Hamilton, Madison, and Jay are very, they understand the importance of the moment. So I don't blame them for maybe not always wanting to get into the nuance of the details, right? That's not what this is about. This is to persuade people to ratify the Constitution. And so these Federalist Papers were, again, written in newspaper articles from October 1787 to April 1788. Also, that means that they're very repetitive, as they should be. Yeah, I mean, these articles are coming out on a regular basis in newspapers, and you don't always know that the person reading your article for the particular day read the one before it, right? You don't want to assume that whoever's reading these articles in the newspaper has read all of them. So you have to keep repeating yourself. You have to also, like, you can't just completely repeat yourself, but you have to, like, be willing to repeat certain things so that you kind of hit everybody who's interested, and don't assume that they've read everything, right? So that's a big part, I think, of why they write the way that they do. It should be said that most of them are written by Hamilton, and then a lot of them are written by Madison, and very few by Jay. Apparently, he got sick during this time and wasn't available to write as many. In the beginning of papers, they're really concerned with arguing against some of the ideas at the time, which were, hey, we should just be 13 separate states. This Articles of Confederation didn't work out. Maybe we should just be 13 separate states. Or another idea that seems to be in the mix is maybe we should break up into 3 or 4 states. And this seems to be deeply troubling to Hamilton, and he writes a lot of papers arguing why this is not a good idea. Like, yes, it's going to be hard. We're going to have 13 different points of view at times, sometimes more, sometimes less. That's not going to be easy, but like, we're better together, we're stronger together. And they use a lot of examples from history at various different countries in Europe and across the world, where they had these kind of loose confederations of states, and how this didn't quite work out. Again, I think they're trying to convince us. They're not necessarily doing a whole nuanced take of history. But they spend a lot of time trying to argue against this idea of breaking up into smaller regions. And so that's in some of the beginning papers. And they move on to lots of different things. I mean, there's a lot of papers on taxation. It makes sense. It's a very important part of being a country, but it's also going to be a very controversial part. I mean, even to this day, taxation comes up every single election cycle, if not more. So it's an important and contentious issue. Also, we all know the history of the Revolutionary War and how taxation was involved there. So they have to spend a lot of papers on taxation, and to try to convince people that these tax the way that they've written the laws around tax is reasonable. And there's lots of different papers in there. That's why I'm saying they're pretty repetitive at times, and not every single one feels very significant. But it is interesting to read through it. It's interesting, I think, as a person in 2024, who sometimes we all kind of feel a little bit like frustrated with politics. It is interesting to go back and just kind of think about how the U.S. Constitution came to be, and why certain things were done the way that they were, which was, I think, was just a good reflection um, for myself. But eventually, 9 states did ratify the Constitution, which was the minimum. This was on June 1788. Then eventually, 11 states ratified on July 1788, and then the last state to ratify was Rhode Island on May 1790. So, of course, as we know, the U.S. Constitution was ratified, and I guess we can debate how much the Federalist Papers played a role in that or not. I just want to kind of use the rest of my time discussing this just to point out some what I thought were kind of just surprising things that I learned, or just I'm not going to try to go through the entire thing because that's not possible. But there's just some things I want to highlight that I think are um, are quite interesting. But one thing I'll start out with is, one of the later papers written by Hamilton expresses his skepticism towards a Bill of Rights, which I think as U.S. citizens we think of the Bill of Rights as like this triumphant thing, and I don't know that I've ever thought about not having it, but this apparently was put in order to appease New York State, and that was like the thing that they put in as a compromise um, to get New York to ratify the Constitution. So that was a big compromise. And I think there's a theme throughout the Federalist Papers of compromise, because you have to remember there's these 13 states, and there's all kinds of different important people in all these different colonies at the time. Sorry, and they have lots of different ideas, right? And if you want to try to unify them into one government, that's going to involve compromise. There's just no way around it. So they're very practical at times when they're talking about different arguments for different points of view. That they seem to be saying like, yeah, this is not exactly the ideal way I'd want it, but we have to compromise, and this is the best we can do given these opposing positions. And honestly, this is the way I think about the U.S. government system. We're not so good at compromising these days, but I think the way the system is built with all these overlocking, checks and balances, um, which is something discussed a lot in the Federalist Papers, you have to compromise because our system breaks down if you don't, right? There's just so many complicated ways that things can be thwarted in the U.S. government that if you're not willing to compromise, there'll be some point along the process where your goal will just not be met, right? So I think you already see that in the Federalist Papers. And again, if you just think about this point in history, it's such a momentous time. If you screw this up and you fail at passing the U.S. Constitution, like who knows what happens next? So you better be willing to compromise. Like this, it's just so important to what the project that they're trying to accomplish. Some other interesting things that I just want to highlight is that at times when they're talking about the executive, they consider the fact, well, what if we had two executives? Which is an idea I've never even crossed my mind, They, of course, reject this idea, but they do consider it, and it's interesting just to kind of think about it. They also, of course, talk about lifetime appointments of judges and other types of appointments they could have made. I only bring that up because that's something that's been talked about quite a bit in the last 10 years. We have been talking about how we should maybe reform that, and it's interesting to go back to the Federalist Papers where they talk about why they did lifetime appointments, and also to consider some of the other ideas that were floating around that they could have applied instead. They also talked about the possibility of have a constitutional convention maybe every 10 years, every 20 years, every 50 years, every 100 years. and they reject that, and instead we have like this amendments process to change the Constitution. But it's an interesting idea to think about. Maybe should we have a constitutional convention every? I think 10 years is way too often, but I don't know, 50, 100 years. I don't know. I mean, we'd have to be careful about what that looks like. I think, if I was Hamilton and Madison and Jay at the time, I might be a little bit concerned, they seeing how difficult of a process it is, and how unstable or potentially unstable process it could be if it fails. It might be worrying to think about doing this on a regular basis. It's potentially, but maybe there are ways that we could have codified some rules around it that actually would have been healthy. Maybe it's not like we're going to completely rewrite the Constitution, but we're going to consider amendments or something like this. I don't know. So they consider this, but they reject this idea in their arguments. And then something else that was particularly surprising, and maybe your history buffs out there will not be surprised by this, but I suspect a lot of U.S. citizens will be. I'm just not aware of this, but it turns out that in the beginning, senators were not elected by the people like the way we do it now, right? In the beginning, senators were appointed by the state legislators. And so it's like an even further indirect move in the democracy, right? So technically, you're voting for your state legislators. And so then you're indirectly voting for your senator, but this is like a very big indirect move here, right? So um, the only house, or the only, yeah, only the U.S. House of Representatives was directly voted for under the way it's talked about in the Federalist Papers in the Constitution. Of course, we know for the president, um, there's this other system that also didn't directly involve voting the way that we think about it now. I won't talk too much about that, but it's interesting to me that the state legislators were chosen, or the senators were chosen by the state legislators. I think this also comes down to the idea that the Senate, which is made up of two senators from each state, so 100 senators in general, is supposed to be like the more stable body in the Congress. And so by having them appointed by the state legislators, for one, it gives the states like more influence and more power, and it's a kind of way of compromising on states' rights by giving them this opportunity. But it also, I think, is seen as like a way of stabilizing the Senate, because I think in general, when you read the Federalist Papers, you can tell that they are a little bit concerned about just the general public getting involved in voting for these various different parts of the government. So I think again, this was a way of ensuring that the Senate was more stable, but also as a compromise to give the states sort of more rights and influence over the government. This was changed by the 17th Amendment on April 8th, 1913. And after that, senators are elected by the public, which is what we're used to this day. That's how we elect senators. Now, I still think that the way that we elect senators now, senators are generally, the Senate generally is the more stable body, partly because it's only 100 senators, partly because there's two from each state. But also, I think it's just that the sheer size makes it a much more stable body, and the rules and things governing it. Another fact that was interesting about the House of Representatives is that in the beginning, the ratio was one representative to 30,000 U.S. citizens, which is a fairly small ratio compared to what we have today. If we tried to impose that same ratio today, we would need 11,000, on the order of 11,000 representatives. Should we have 11,000 representatives? I don't think so. I think that's probably too big. That's a lot of representatives. But it does seem like having the ratio be around 30,000 people probably makes it feel like, as a citizen, that you're like closer to the actual representative in some way. Unfortunately, it became just impractical. I think 11,000 representatives is impractical. And so now we have, as you probably know, 435 representatives, which means that the ratio is, way, way different. There's way more people to each senator. And it's an interesting question to me how much that difference in ratio affects, how much as citizens we feel connected to our government. I think it's a necessary evil. I don't think we can fix it so directly at this point, but interesting fact to me. And of course, the House is the more raucous of the houses of Congress, and I think that is also the way that the it's discussed in the Federalist Papers, right? They're voted in every 2 years. That's already a more raucous process, whereas the senator is voted every 6 years, and not all of them at the same time, right? So all the representatives go up for election at the same time. So there's just a much larger turnover at a much quicker rate in the House. And something that's interesting as well that just reminded me of in the papers, they talk about how maybe we should elect representatives every year, or maybe every 6 months, and they reject this idea. And I think that's so important because having election every 6 months, every year, this is crazy. Like that's way too often, right? That's way too destabilizing. The House is already like a very raucous part of the Congress. If you had elections every year for every single representative, that's just way too much turnover, way too often. So they reject that idea. But all these things are up for debate. How long should a president serve? How long should a senator serve? How long should a representative serve? All these things are being discussed in a lot of detail in these Federalist Papers. So I'll leave it there. Those are kind of some of the interesting things that I wanted to discuss. And yeah, I hope you take if you're interested, take a chance and read some of these papers. Maybe read them all with some friends you have or some people you want to discuss with, and let me know what you think and comment and I'd be happy to discuss. Thanks.